My train of thought was interrupted by a dull thump on the floor. As if a sack of grain had been dropped. The rustling was getting closer and closer. I pressed myself against the back of the sofa and bit the blanket until my gums hurt. It felt like something heavy was being dragged along the floor. A loud senile cough completely unbalanced me. I jumped up from the sofa and took an umbrella from a nearby bag. I understood that it was stupid, but it's better to have this than nothing. Putting my weapon in front of me, I slowly began to walk towards the exit. I already wanted to run, but I came to my senses in time. In order to get to the exit, you need to bypass the door to my grandmother's bedroom. My nerves were at the limit. In the meantime, it appeared from there. It seemed, no, this cannot be. Something crawled out of the dark opening into the moonlight. It crawled out. A huge creature with an ugly body covered with blisters, abscesses and some tatters. Thick, swollen legs turned back only remotely resembled human ones. The hands, if you could call them that, had only 3 thumbs with dirty nails. On a short fleshy neck was the head of grandmother's. The ugly creature, with a crunch and champ, turned in my direction, along the way leaving a fetid musky trail on the floor with its belly hanging to the ground. "Hi, my dear. Go to grandma. Hug." This creature stretched its mouth in a vile smile, exposing crooked, yellow big teeth. The lower jaw opened so much that a crunch of tearing ligaments was heard. The jaw hung limply, tearing the face along the line of the lips. Saliva dripped onto the floor. Bruises appeared on the cheeks. The eyes of the grandmother were rounded and fell out of their sockets. They hung only on the nerves holding them. From the torn mouth with wheezing and mucus escaped laughter, wild and inhuman. Pascuda stood and whinnied, looking at me with bloody gaps in her eyes. A few seconds later, the creature lunged at me, squishing in greasy folds and dangling tongues. The numbness lasted for a few seconds, but those few seconds could have cost me my life. With the dexterity of a cat, I jumped to the side, which is why the scum, jumping over the sofa, hit the chest of drawers in front with all its weight and smashed it to pieces. Getting up and rubbing my bruised knee, I flew out into the yard like a bullet. But then the unexpected happened. The fact is that the path to the house was washed away by a night downpour, and therefore, having jumped off the porch, I slipped and fell, kissing the back of my head on the ground with relish. It tingled in the nose. The main thing is not to lose consciousness. While I was trying to come to my senses, grandmother appeared at the door of the house. With a wild screech, like a huge beetle, she jumped and fell on me, intending to tear off my head. I put my hands out in time, keeping her head at a distance from mine. From her fetid womb, saliva flowed at me along with a scream. With all my might, I tried to keep the creature, but she was in no hurry to give up. The upper part of the head, like a hellish kind of surprise, leaned back, revealing a bleeding trachea, from which a snake-like long tongue protruded. Without waiting for the scum to use it, I contrived and smacked my fist on the exposed part of the flesh. The creature instantly loosened its grip and howled, recoiling to the side. I got up from the wet ground and wanted to run and call for help, but the quickly recovering trash blocked my way. I had no choice but to run to the barn. I realized that creature wanted to drive me into a trap in order to finish me off later, but did not want to give up without a fight. At the speed of light, I ran into the barn and closed the gate from the inside with a large thick beam. Just a monstrous blow was heard, from which dust and chips fell from the ceiling of the old barn. However, I had an advantage over this monster. I knew my grandmother's yard by heart. As a child, I noticed a small depression near the barn gate, which was intended for water drainage, so that the hay would not become damp in the rains. This is what saved my life. While the creature was beating against the gate with furious force, I managed to remove a sharpened metal sheet from an old side lying next to it and lie down on the bottom of this sewer recess. And just in time, the barn doors flew off their hinges at the same moment. It was inside. There's no turning back. Either die or kill him. As soon as I thought about it, an ugly head in a torn scarf with tangled hair appeared above me in the blink of an eye. With a sharp movement, it reached out to me, but I was ready for this. Leaning forward, I drove the blade of the scythe to the very base right in the eye of the monster. Blood, black as tar, spattered from the wound in a fountain, splashing me from head to toe. This fiend of hell let out a heartbreaking cry and began to rush from side to side, touching the flimsy props holding the roof of the barn. I immediately realized, if I don't get out of here as soon as possible, this beast will bury us both under the rubble of this damn barn. Quickly jumping out of the cracking barn, I rushed to the car. A few seconds later, I heard a terrible crack and the roar of breaking wood behind me. The barn folded in half like a house of cards, burying that creature under it. Without waiting for what could happen next, I sped up my run. Leaping through the bushes, I rushed at full speed to my car, Now it was my last hope for salvation. However, it was too early to rejoice. Already standing at the car, I heard a heavy clatter. The scum decided to run around the house from the other side, but how did she manage to survive? I did not have time to think about this, because from around the corner of the house the mutilated carcass of that monster was already rushing towards me. Giving up trying to open the car, I again decided on a desperate plan. I ran towards the river, shouting insulting obscene expressions at this image. My plan worked. She ran in my direction. I quickly went down the wet sand to the shore and rushed across the reeds to the raft. Thoroughly getting wet, I stopped on it and began to wave my hands, calling the creature. She was not averse to coming closer. The creature stopped on the shore, grinning viciously and preparing to jump. At this time, I was already counting the seconds before him. A jump. In a fraction of a second I saw this creature again in all its details and I jumped under its feet. It clearly did not expect such a turn. Trying in vain to dodge, the creature stumbled over me and fell with a roar onto a flimsy raft, which immediately broke into two halves. Rumbling viciously and splashing wildly, the creature raised a flurry of spray. After briefly watching this from the shore, I rushed back to the car, falling a couple of times on the wet ground. Having reached my arrow, I pressed the gas pedal all the way. My swallow took off and slipped into a turn. After a while, a familiar ugly silhouette loomed in the rearview mirror. Not knowing what to do next, instead of leaving this village, I turned towards the cemetery. Some unknown force was calling me there. Leaving the car, I made my way to the cemetery gates as quickly as possible. Opening them, I rushed to my grandmother's grave. I hugged the headstone and, to my surprise, I felt warm. Real warmth. It was like Grandma was hugging me again. I closed my eyes and clung to the stove even more, feeling like a child again. Clean, carefree and bright. I woke up only the next morning at the same grave. My head hurt terribly, and my whole body felt weak. Consciousness seemed to be clouded by a fog. All yesterday's events seemed like a bad dream, but abrasions and wounds on the body spoke of the opposite. I involuntarily looked at the portrait of my grandmother. She still looked with bright eyes and smiled. Rising up, I hugged the tombstone again, whispering, "Thank you, Grandma." I kissed the portrait. After that, all dirty and lame, I reached my 9, got into it and drove back to the house. What I saw once again confirmed that the events of yesterday night were not a dream or a delusion. The front door was lying on the steps of the porch, some windows were broken, traces curled around the yard and nearby. What was left of the barn could be seen from behind the house. When I went inside, I saw a complete mess and devastation. Dishes and furniture were broken. There were deep scratches on the wallpaper, clothes and other things were scattered everywhere. On wadded legs, I went to the sofa and sat on it, trying to digest the events of the past days. I sat like this for an hour, and then abruptly packed my things and hurriedly left the village in my arrow, without saying anything to anyone. But just before leaving the village, I stopped and looked towards the cemetery. Mentally thanked my grandmother again, and with peace of mind I drove towards the house with calmness that only my grandmother could give me. At home, my mother called me, asking how the trip went. Naturally, I did not tell anything. I lied that, they say, I went normally, nothing special. And this answer suited her perfectly. After discussing some other things, we said goodbye. Going online, I decided to find out if something similar had happened to other people. After digging through several sites, I found out that scum was a restless soul, which I foolishly managed to disturb. First, without permission, I entered my grandmother's house, then sat on her bed, and then I completely wished that she would return. I also managed to find out that when the soul leaves the body, for several days it is in such a borderline state, in which it is very vulnerable to the effects of all kinds of evil spirits. Here, apparently, one of these entities decided to seize the moment. I don't know how it works, and I don't really want to know. Everything is already over. Nevertheless, life gradually began to return to its usual course. The days flowed with an ordinary routine. I switched to the 4th year of the university, again a pile of homework, worries and other joys. During these classes, I gradually began to forget that horror experienced, until it completely disappeared from my memory. My studies were coming to an end, and with it the end of my institute life was coming. The last year at the university made me sweat a lot. The last session was nightmarishly difficult, but I successfully closed it. Parents were in 7th heaven with happiness. They decided not to limit themselves to congratulations by phone. From day to day I was waiting for their arrival. The plan for the next few days was very clear: cleaning, cooking, laundry. Having brought the apartment into proper condition on the eve of my parents' arrival, I arranged dishes that were modest by the standards of a student on the table in anticipation of the guests. The ringing trill of the doorbell made me start. Running to the door, I threw it open, and immediately a scream froze in my throat. Parents stood on the threshold with a wide smile, and Grandma stood behind them. Before my eyes, the terrible events of past years immediately surfaced, awakening a deep-seated horror. A grinning face with a drooping jaw greedily bared its teeth somewhere in the back of memory. But the real picture was quite different. Standing in front of me was my grandmother in her normal form. No, she no longer looked like a disfigured corpse. On the contrary, she looked more alive than all the living. And that scared me even more. I looked at her for a few seconds until my father's voice pulled me out of my stupor. "Hey, why are you standing at the door? Let the guests at least go over the threshold." I automatically stepped aside, not taking my eyes off my grandmother. My gaze was first noticed by my mother. "What are you, Sen? Didn't he recognize your own grandmother? Hug her at least, she missed you very much." After her words, the grandmother, slightly putting her hands forward, went towards me. There was a smile on her face, but I did not feel life and sincerity in her. Even when we hugged, I didn't feel absolutely nothing. I didn't feel that native warmth that was in my arms before. But the parents seemed to stubbornly refuse to notice this, and calmly went to lay out the food brought to the table. Dad and Mom went into the kitchen with Grandma, and I rushed to my room. Turning the desk drawer on the floor, I began to scatter the sheets in handfuls. Aha! Found. The yellow-pink paper about the grandmother's death was still there. Grabbing it, I wanted to head to the kitchen, but I didn't even have time to get to my feet. Turning to the door, I was speechless and sank to the floor. Grandma was standing in the doorway. Her dress and face were stained with fresh blood. The skin turned from pink to deathly gray, the eyes turned black, and a long scarlet tongue appeared from the mouth. Passing them over her lips, licking off the blood, the grandmother grinned maliciously. "Hi, my dear. Go to Grandma, hug."